administration, but also I've loved generally just, I really love the students. I love how authentic and really unassuming and hardworking they are. And it's just been a real gift to kind of teach them. And I haven't had, I knock on wood, a bad student yet. So yeah.
That's great. So I want to get around to asking you about Facebook and data and information privacy, but let me start with this. All right, I'll start with a sip of bourbon. How did you get interested in law? I described kind of the resume version of your path, but how'd you get interested in law, and how'd you get interested in the internet and social media, and how did those things come together for you?
Yeah, they're kind of related. I mean, they're all about kind of I think there's an amount that it's kind of an innate curiosity, which happens to like excite me about the internet, which is that I feel that it's just so many questions to be asked. And I am a question asking person. I was always the gunner. They didn't have that name for it in elementary school, but I was definitely the gunner in my elementary school class. But when it came to law, as you said, both my mother and my father met studying for the bar exam. So that was like, a lore that I got my entire life. I remember.
So you were the progeny of law nerds from the beginning.
Yeah, but like, it's interesting. Yes, but it's like, it's much more subtle than that. Like, they weren't like, you're going to go to law school. It was just everywhere. So that was like, I would be editing my 4th grade history essay, and I would be fighting with my mom about edits on like my 4th grade history essay, which you can imagine was like basically like Shakespeare. It was like beautiful. I was very attached to my words. And I'd be arguing with my mom, this is how I wanted to say it. And my dad would say, your mother was editor of the law review. Like, stop arguing with her. Just like, she knows what she's talking about. And I'd be like, what the hell is the law review? I'm in 4th grade. But like, it was that type of thing my entire life, for most of my life. And in elementary school, when I was in 3rd grade, my mom ran for trial for a Supreme Court in New York State, which thankfully most of our alumni probably knows is the highest trial court. And she served there for 27 years and doing civil work, and never serving on the criminal court. Actually, she only did civil work. And my dad was basically like a JP, like a justice of the peace, a town justice. He served in the Judicial Conduct Commission, so he did a lot of ethics work. And he did people's wills and estates. He did people's real estate closings. So my entire life, I heard these stories of like, this entire like time I heard these stories of basically like, oh, I'm going to a closing. I can't pick you up from soccer practice because I'm going to a closing. And like, I didn't know what a closing was, but now it's like, I actually tell that story when I talk to students, because it's kind of like, I'm trying to teach them about the difference between a promise that something's going to happen and the actual conveyance of the land through the deed, and that happens in a closing. And it just kind of always, when I teach this, is almost a little bit of a religious moment for me of coming back to like these words and these terms that I never knew or really truly understood when I was growing up, but like I've come around to in a certain way, if that makes sense.
And so what made you decide that you wanted to become a law professor, and in particular a scholar of social media, the internet, information?
Well, I would actually also say the weird thing about what I teach is that I teach property, because most people who do what I do either do IP very exclusively and then go into internet law and whatever. And I did do IP. I've written papers in IP, but like that is not my predominant area of research at all. And most people who write about internet, like law and tech, write it from a torts perspective because it's mostly about speech harms. It's mostly about harms that are created on the internet and how to answer them. Or it's about 4th Amendment protections. And this is like the Oren Kerr kind of like the idea that you have like the government using private platforms to infringe on your 4th Amendment privacy rights. And so neither of those are my areas. I just love property, and I think that the like numerous clauses, the forms of property, are really wonderful metaphors for basically almost everything that happens, specifically in the internet, specifically like co-syndrome and things like that. Not to be too geeky about it, but like it's I found myself coming to internet law and social media basically because I saw the world going to internet law and social media. I saw the entire, like, there was something that I will never forget when I was, okay, sorry to keep mentioning like grade school and stuff, but there were these distinctive moments, which is like I was in 10th grade and I had a live journal and it got discovered by all of the faculty. And there wasn't anything salacious on it. I was just a teenage girl writing a live journal. It's now a very common thing. But back then it was like horrible. Like there was all of these social kind of like, that was just so open and exposed to be talking about, like, it wasn't even talking about that much stuff. I knew it was a public thing. But to do something like that, and I remember a teacher saying, I'm so embarrassed for you. This internet thing just isn't going to work out. I really hope that you I hope that you have more judgment in the future. And I was like, no, lady, you're going to realize that the entire world is going to change and my entire generation is going to understand how this thing works. And that kind of moment is, I guess, what has always inspired me towards like looking at internet law and like online speech.
I'm always reminded of the generation you are part of, and sort of your moment in that generation, in that your Gmail address and your Twitter handle are both your last name, and that's it. Meaning you were an early adopter of both of those things. And of course of Facebook. So let me ask you about Facebook. And I'll just ask an open-ended question. What was it like to be embedded last year in the Facebook headquarters with the people designing the oversight board, with Facebook brass, including Mark Zuckerberg? Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it was a little surreal. I felt glad that I had insulation from outside brands to have like financial independence from Facebook, because that was not like initially on the slate, was that they were like, well, just pay, you can just come. And I was like, oh, no. And so I got really lucky. I applied for a number of grants and I got some grants, as you know. And then, so I was able to spend a lot of time there. The day-to-day is like, there's a couple really interesting things I think that maybe people will be interested in. One, that it is of course a very young culture. Like the whole place is very young, and it is called a campus. So there is like this kind of, it's sprawling, and there's all of these, there's like bikes to go different places and you can take the bikes out, and there's like an internal Uber between the different buildings at Facebook, and all of these kind of like various things to connect to campus. Those are all very typical corporate culture type of things to a certain extent. And the micro kitchens with like all of their little like bizarro snacks and the 75 flavors of seltzer water and like all of the kind of the crazy things like that. That's all true. But I would say that like one of the most profound things to me happened when I would be there until 5 o'clock. And if you're there until 5 o'clock at Facebook, what you start noticing is that all of the people that are working on visas that are coming in, that have been employed by like Facebook, come in and they bring their, like, so there are all these restaurants and all of these kind of things internally, they feed everyone at Facebook. All of a sudden, people's entire families and extended families are showing up. Like they have their entire, they're bringing in you see a grandmother walking through with like grandchildren and like their wife, and like this like 7-person family going to get dinner. And this happens all over the place. And this is like totally fine. Like this is all over, like this is completely accepted. But what I think this is interesting for, in terms of governance and in terms of corporate governance and the public-private partnership, is we have these moments of what we call thrash in private companies, where employees disagree with the public-facing policies of the firm, right? They don't like Facebook's policy on like climate change. They don't like it on disinformation. So they decide to thrash against it and they walk out or do something like that. Who's going going to do that when you have a visa that's hinged on it, or you have to feed your family based on that visa. And as you increasingly have a globalized population that is employed by these companies, and that's going to happen whether COVID happens or not, you're going to increasingly have people, like, there just is a sheer need for engineers, and that's going to be everywhere. That those types of things are really important going forward. And I think that it's going to, I think that those are going to be key things about like whether or not we can affect change within the company from the employee standpoint, which is one of the best points of leverage as far as I can tell, because users don't have a particular point of leverage.
Interesting. So if you think about Facebook as a government, as a state rather than a company, the users, which might be seen as the population, really don't have much ability to affect Facebook's policies, and the employees do. And I guess you'd think about them as the bureaucracy of the government.
The government workers, like the deep state or otherwise. Yeah.
Interesting. And of course, the visa workers then are kind of like, well, the undocumented in a way, who just have less ability to take advantage of civil rights and opportunities to speak out.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, so there's I don't know, it's unclear how these things are going to filter down. These seemed really like things like being able to have proximity to, like, you know, having like 3 meals a day and all of these things seemed, and being in the United States seemed a lot more important than it does now, right? And a lot more possible than it does now, obviously. So that's something important to think about. But it is like, I think it's something to not lose sight of as we come out of this, because I think that it will return as a point of leverage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a two-part question, kind of steering us a little bit towards COVID-19, and then I want to open the floor to questions from our alumni. Before the pandemic, your expertise in content moderation was in some ways about, it was about hate speech, it was about obscenity, it was about pornography, it was about how are these big platforms balancing First Amendment values, not the First Amendment itself, but First Amendment values, and their role as kind of overlords of these communities. With the pandemic now, does misinformation become even more important and more of a global challenge? And then related to that, what about privacy? And I'm particularly thinking about cell phones and locational privacy, and potential for apps that will tell you whether you've come in contact with a person who may or may not have COVID-19.
Yeah, it's so many questions. Okay, but yes, just to back up, most people assume, I just want to like clarify for everyone, most people assume that when I say content moderation, I mean that like everyone posts something on Facebook, and that is the availability of that in Facebook or YouTube or Twitter is subject to the terms of service, not the terms of service, they call it community standards, but it's like a terms of service. It's called community standards, which are their rules, basically, their speech rules, basically. Similar to like a college campus speech rules almost in a lot of ways. And they enforce these rules in this private capacity, and they delete speech if it has been found to be in violation. And how they delete that speech and how they adjudicate whether something has violated those rules is done by human people all over the world. So Facebook employs 10 to 30,000 full and part-time workers all over the world, working 24 hours a day. That's a lot of people, but it also makes sense when you think that there's like 1 billion pieces of content posted every single day. And of that, probably like millions of pieces of content that are reported by users to be reviewed by human content moderators. It's just a boggling amount of adjudication. But most people think that this is done by AI or algorithms. It's not, it's done by humans. So to your point about COVID, Facebook announced about 3 days after, I would say, the widespread ban kind of really took place, like around like probably, I think it was like March 18th, Facebook announced that they were going to be sending all of their content moderators home. All of their 10 to 30,000 content moderators would be getting full pay. and they still be paid, whether they're part-time or full-time, they would still be getting paid, but they could not review content moderation. And everyone's like, well, why can't they review content from their couch? Why can't they work from home? Well, if you have someone publishing sexually explicit pictures or any type of pictures, there are huge privacy issues. And so if you're flagging other people's information, they have all of these restrictions in place in the call centers that most people answer this stuff in, so that you can't take screenshots of it, you can't take photos of it. There's special screens that won't register for your phone, like you can't take a photo of it, and you're closely supervised so that you can't like basically carry out the content that you review, and they can't do that if you're working from home. So the result was the only things that they're reviewing with human content moderation, and this is kind of like the importance of human decision making in the loop, kind of algorithmic question, is really sensitive content, which is like which they label as terrorist content, self-harm content, and child sexual exploitive imagery, and COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation. And to that, they are listening basically to WHO and CDC guidelines in determining what comes up and comes down. And they are ignoring public figure or private figure determinations, which, as I've written about before, like they have as a caveat to all of their newsworthiness kind of components, exceptions of their content policy stuff, which means that the Brazilian president, if he says, children cannot get COVID-19, children are immune from COVID-19, they will take down all of his statements that say that, either the direct ones or any news reports of him saying that, because they feel that it is harmful disinformation. What this means for free speech is a great question.
So let me interrupt for a second. And my sense as an uninformed observer is that at least Facebook has tried in its content moderation to stay very far away from political disputes and things about which politicians are disagreeing.
Yes, totally.
Is COVID causing them to wade much more into the middle of the substance of sort of disagreements about what various political leaders might be saying?
Yeah, and they're certainly riding a wave of high priority, which is just basically like this idea that like Facebook, people want access to Facebook, and they're willing to put up with a lot more from them and a lot more error than they have been in the past. You will notice that maybe for the first time in 2 weeks, there has not been like basically besides, and we'll get to the privacy thing you brought up about Zoom and some other things, but like besides privacy issues, the big thing has basically, I said this as soon as this happened, I was like, is it true that a virus is finally going to be the cure for the techlash? That they have been struggled for 3 or 4 years, all of these major tech companies to come out from underneath the negative press and the negative reputational cost that they're suffering. And I think that this is like, maybe this is the next wave. Like maybe this is like, this is like the thing that changes it all.
So you think this could lead to, let's say, Facebook becoming more trusted than, let's say, the government, however you want to characterize that?
Well, like this is, I was making a joke with some law professor friends recently, but it was like rank like the 3 things in like order of how much you trust them. It was like the federal government, the state government, the local government, and private tech companies. And it was like, it was just kind of like, okay, federal government was, for us anyways, coming out last. And it was like, we had felt really well served by local and state government, a lot of people. And I think that has been a little bit the narrative. I can't tell whether that's the media narrative or not. Like it might just be.
And where were tech companies falling in that hierarchy?
Tech companies were like somewhere in the middle, which was way more than they would have been like about like 3 weeks ago, like, which is crazy to think that it's only been 3 weeks. So
I'm gonna we're gonna shift the conversation to
see, Josh asked a question.
But Josh asked the question, and I've got to search through the
to unmute him.
Areas I found him, and Josh, I'm gonna unmute you so you can ask your question. There we go, Joshua. How you doing?
Good. How are you? Good to see both of you.
Thanks for joining us.
Good to hear you, Josh. Go ahead with your question.
Sure. So what legal hurdles does Apple and Google's contact tracing face? That's like the program that they have for people if they've been in contact with someone with COVID-19 to know that they've been in contact with somebody with COVID-19. Does this have issues with HIPAA or privacy laws and the implications from there? Thank you.
And Kate, before you answer, I'm going to jump in, and so these are sort of like location service apps that are designed to figure out where people are and where people with COVID-19 are, and presumably that connects up with who they are. And it reminds me a little bit of the privacy experiment you did in your class.
Controversial privacy experiment.
Right around this time, which was very much using kind of location to figure out who people were. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. So Josh, Mike is talking about an experiment that I did. Well, not an experiment. It was like an exercise that it was not in any way an experiment, actually. Don't yell at me. IRB. It wasn't
the IRB.
It was just a fun experiment. I had 9 people in my class, and unfortunately or fortunately, I happened to often write for the New York Times, and my New York Times editor saw me write up a thread about this on Twitter and asked me to write a story about it, which put it on blast. But basically, it was the idea that I told my students to go out in my information privacy class, and they were about to go on spring break, and I said, listen, when you go on spring break, I do not want you to eavesdrop. I do not want you to do anything to try to hear a conversation. But what I want you to do is to try to see how much information people give off in public, assuming that by obscurity, they are not findable or not searchable in any type of way. And so you can have the monogram on their, and what I want you to do is to search on Google, only using Google, not using Facebook, not using anything. Search on Google, see if you can, you hear their name, they have a monogram on their shirt or like a label on their shirt or some type of thing. You can use that and things that they say, and you see if you can do a Google search and be able to find their full name in a couple of minutes of listening to their conversation. And without every single person in the class was able to do this. And some also suddenly observed that by just listening, they observed other people revealing things like reading their full credit card out loud in the Starbucks in a public place, and all of this type of really private information, assuming that they were in this obscure place and they were fine. I think that Mike is basically relating this to your question, Josh, because the issue is we have all of this assumption about how private we are through obscurity. Now, everyone is suspect of everyone, and there's certain amounts of questions and issues that are coming up all the time, and these types of apps are happening. And so people can be outed and shamed in these public ways. And so, is this a problem? And I would say, yes, it is a problem. The tracing apps they do not seem to be facing HIPAA. They don't seem to have HIPAA issues, frankly. They do maybe seem to have terms of service issues with Google and Apple and other types of things, but they would not have gotten through the app approval software if they did. So it is either going to be about a substantive, basically a very substantive change in the norms that we expect around privacy that changes what we think about what privacy means, or what it means in this moment, if judges were to enforce those terms of service in the contracts, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So it's basically the terms of service are implied certainly by these things, but what we understand about them is yet to be determined, because we just don't understand, and the norms around basically what a reasonable person would expect in the situation are unclear.
So Josh, that was a great question. I'm going to a little belatedly introduce you to the rest of the alumni crowd. Josh is a recent grad. And I would describe Josh as one of the more intellectually curious students we've had come through the law school in recent years, always filled with great questions. The next question is coming from Katie Wolfgang. I'm going to unmute Katie now and also introduce her a little bit. Katie, I'm not going to remember the year you graduated. It was probably about 5 years ago.
2012. I'm old.
goodness, 8 years ago.
That's the year I graduated. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Kate. We
Katie.
actually know a lot of people in common, but I'll let Mike continue.
Okay.
So Katie is went from St. John's to Davis Polk, went from Davis Polk to the Court of Appeals as one of the very first clerks for our Chief Judge, Janet T. Fiore, and then back to Davis Polk, although interestingly, Katie is now seconded to Facebook and actually has a question about Facebook in the 2020 election. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike and Kate. Thanks for doing this. It's been very cool to hear you talk about it because I've heard and followed a little bit of the oversight board work at Facebook. Full disclosure, I've been there since October, and I'm doing a mix of anti-corruption, privacy, and now COVID-19 work. But my question for you is, I was very curious what, if anything, the oversight board is doing or thinking about with respect to the 2020 election and how to kind of prepare for that. And I'm asking, with the back of my mind, and I think probably the back of everybody's mind in the world, quite frankly, with sort of the botched response to 2016 at Facebook. So very curious your thoughts on that.
Such a smart question. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, this is like, there was just a call with a bunch of people that I was on, and there have been a few calls where they're talking about this, but the content moderation generally. But like, to your election 2020 question, I would actually say, if I can not punt this, but tell you a few people that you'd want to follow in order to get the best possible information. One would be Nate Persily, who's a Stanford law professor, who I would basically say is like the predominant, like the most educated person on online platforms and democracy and elections in the world. Like, he currently right now is consulting with, I think, about like 50 different governments about how to run their like elections in the midst of COVID. And he is absolutely brilliant and has an infinite capacity for answering questions about this stuff and is much smarter than I am about it. But from what he tells me, the main concerns around turning the election turning for the election administration is basically trying to figure out how to go to mail-in ballot, and whether or not that's going to be sufficient in any real way. There are a lot of differences in socioeconomic responses to mail-in ballot. It's not universal how people decide who decides to engage in an election based on mail-in ballot, and who trusts the mail and who doesn't. And so there's that as a factor, which is super fascinating. But also Nate oversees the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, which has something called the Internet Observatory, which is headed by Alex Stamos, who's the former chief security officer actually at Facebook. And now he's turned his entire life's work towards working on mis and disinformation, specifically around elections right now, and researching this. And he and his colleagues, Kate Starbird and Rihanna Peppercorn and some others, have done some great studies that are coming out that you should look at about how to understand mis and disinformation on these platforms. I'm just going to say really quickly, I think that basically mis and disinformation around the elections and COVID are the two biggest concerns of Facebook that are new outside of their traditional concerns around terrorism, self-harm, and child exploitation. I think that they've really honed in on this pretty quickly, as given the fact that you have now a new title probably around COVID-19. And so I think that hopefully that means that there's going to be, we're going to be moving in the right directions, but we're really looking for good signals from noise. I'm just kind of directing you to Nate and Alex, because I think they're the best signal for noise value.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear from you.
Yeah.
Kate, let me ask you, without obviously revealing any client confidences, what's been your experience coming from big law into Facebook?
So I think I echo a lot of the sentiments that Kate talked about at the beginning. I don't know who on this call is a Silicon Valley fan, I had watched the show prior to doing any tech work. And although Facebook is currently a very big client of Davis Polk's, for obvious reasons, their new GC, Jennifer Newstead, is a former Davis Polk partner. I myself had not been working on Facebook prior to going on secondment. So it was very much new client to me, new experience. And I will say that I really felt like I showed up on Hooley campus for the people who watch Silicon Valley when I was there. I mean, there's so much that, you know, I have a very good friend, the best man, and my husband's best friend, the best man at our wedding, is a reporter who has covered a lot of the tech companies. And he would tell us all the time, you guys are missing half the jokes not working in tech. And it's totally true. I mean, completely different experience. I will say, you know, in contrast to big law, I think it's been really wonderful for me to see such a different culture. Mike, I know you yourself had some experience at Davis Polk way back in the day, and as wonderful as a firm it is very buttoned up, it is very proper, it is very say the right thing, be nice to everyone. Facebook people speak their mind. I'm sure Kate saw that. They have their own internal Facebooks where anyone and everyone will tell you what they think about just about anything that comes to mind, which, you know, has its pros and cons. But for me personally, it's been really great to, I think, kind of getting me to be more creative as an attorney. And, you know, certainly is very, very fun. I'm very fortunate to be there and have been having a great time.
Yeah, it's interesting, Katie. You're right. My one experience with big law was a summer at Davis Polk 33 years ago, and I've had much more experience in Silicon Valley in the last several years as dean, getting to know our alumni out there, including some big law partners who are based in Palo Alto, and some very successful alumni who are high up in Apple and Google and elsewhere. And it's been enlightening to me to see the huge cultural differences between New York and Silicon Valley. And obviously Silicon Valley is different than maybe the whole rest of the country, but I wonder if New Yorkers have a particular disconnect from that culture because we are very much the center of our own universe. And there's a whole universe out there that's very different. And we experience it typically as, you know, users of Facebook and Google and consumers of Apple products, as opposed to people immersed in that whole world. Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, I would actually put it as like both like people in Silicon Valley think they're in their own universe and we think we're in our own universe. And so it's two different, entirely different planets, frankly. But to Katie's point, I think that she's exactly right. It is completely unlike big law. It's unlike any of those things. Big law never, I did a summer in big law. It was never going to be my jam, to put it frankly. And like, there is, I don't know that being at Facebook would have been my jam either, but it is a fascinating place to be, to watch as things evolve and watch a different set of questions kind of percolate. And I think that her point, which is that like basically it has its own culture and its own questions. They're both there's just a lot of creativity, I guess, as I would say, is like that comes from this area. You're just gonna not have the same types of questions if you're going to be working in tech. You're going to be, I mean, every legal question is like testing new facts to old facts, right? And the rule, like against the rule. But at the same time, like there's something really wholly different and kind of wonderfully, excitingly precedential about working in tech that I think is really like exhilarating in a way and makes the trade-off worth it. I don't know if Katie feels similarly, but like it's a fun trade-off. And it, you know, it's like a very different, you feel like kind of a little bit wild west about it.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to the next question to one of my former students, Elise Sisolak. And speaking of New Yorkers, Elise is very much a New Yorker and currently working in the New York City employees retirement system. And Elise has a question that is pretty much a follow-up to Josh's question about sort of contact tracing using iPhones and Android phones. Elise, how you doing?
Hey, good. Nice to see you.
Good
No.
to see you too, or at least hear you. Go ahead with your question.
In the terms of service that are in the tracing apps, do they provide any limitations on how the information can be used in addition to telling people that they have been with someone with COVID-19? Are there limitations, and how are they enforced?
Yeah, so there's two questions there. I would say basically there are two issues. One is that like, do they state in terms of service? So let's imagine that they do, right? Like let's imagine that they say that there are some limitations. But that's to your second question, which is like, are they enforceable? I don't know if any of, like, nobody knows if any of these things are enforceable, primarily, I think, because we don't know if the terms of service of the tracing of like the health information of various people, whether they give it up voluntarily or with knowledge or not, gets past a click wrap contract, gets past kind of the new kind of public health type of requirements and the emergency requirements that are kind of in place right now. And like, as I said before, like there's like, you could see courts having, I think, having some type of like very broad standard that if this is brought, let's imagine it being brought in 2 weeks, percolating to 3 months, going to trial, percolating to whatever, basically like this still being understood in the context of the moment that it's happening in, and that changing how courts decide to interpret those provisions of the contract. And what we just simply don't know yet. And I think that this is like, I hate to be another one of those people who's like, I'm really sorry, we don't know. But like, we don't know when we're going to quarantine. We don't know how these contracts are going to be interpreted. It's a great question. To be clear, I also think this is and I don't want to be like overly litigious or urging people towards litigation, but like, these are important things that are going to be litigated. And I hope that like some of our students and our former students like are going to be litigating some of these important privacy issues. And as this evolves, I'm just going to state that like, I would be happy to consult or give like kind of like feedback on briefs and things like that. I think a lot of this stuff is going to be super important in protecting privacy going forward, because I do not think this is probably, unfortunately, the last of these types of incidents, like public health, like kind of crises that we're going to face. And so it makes sense to kind of build a better privacy regime around these types of applications and private applications going forward.
So Kate, let me ask you a follow-up question. You've already said that you think COVID-19 has caused Facebook to take a sort of a different view of its content moderation responsibilities. Do you think I guess what I would call the non-acute stage of COVID-19, right? Once we get through the peak and then the next year until there's a vaccine, do you think that will fundamentally reorder people's thoughts about privacy and willingness to have private data shared?
I would say that it's not just about privacy, that will be one thing, but I would actually say privacy is going to be secondary, because I think that like the primary thing that has to happen before people reorder their thinking about privacy is they have to reorder their thinking about how they share and how they speak, basically. And so like, because like, if you don't speak or share anything, if you're just a mute, like if you just kind of sit there and don't put anything out there on the internet, then your privacy isn't implicated. But what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 is that like literally to have the most basic of human interactions with your mom, your cousins, your friends, your daughter, your grandma, like anyone, you have to have you have to have internet access. You have to have like access to Zoom, Google Hangouts, Facebook Live, like YouTube Live, all of the Twitter, all of these things. And so for a long time, people who have looked at law and tech have thought about the internet in the space, and the internet has been treated, especially by legal academia and the law in general, which is very stodgy and old and doctrinal and slow to change. No offense, Judge Easterbrook, but there's just kind of like this, you have to like, this is kind of, I think what I'm going to predict is like the end of internet exceptionalism, and what a lot of us have seen for a long time, which is that like 16-year-olds talking on LiveJournal is the same as 16-year-olds talking to their friends in the cafeteria, for all intents and purposes of privacy, of speech, of publicity, like all of those types of, like all of those notions that we talk about with speech. And so what it means is that we're going to have to fundamentally rethink how we think about speech, and hopefully it won't just be me thinking, like it will no longer just be me thinking that this is like opining about this, but we'll bring in much smarter people and much like people who have thought about speech more like deeply and thoughtfully into the conversation, and finally like have them understand that this is not like this other thing that's happening. Tech is not an other. It is the same thing that is happening to all of us as a society, and that we have to understand it in order to like kind of understand the next phase of things. I'm fine being a law and tech scholar. I love it. I love my community. But do I wish that I was just kind of like looked at as a law scholar, like that also does internet? Yes, I really like that. You're like a law scholar. Yeah, that's kind of like, I think that like what I do is the law. It's like, it is like, you know, it's free speech, it's property, it's torts, it's criminal law, it's all of those things. It just happens to be I spend a lot of my time thinking about not just how those things happened in 1912, but also how they happened in 2012.
Wow, that's a great sort of note on which we can wrap up. I'm going to do a few thank yous and a few announcements, and then Kate, come back to you for the last word. This has been a wonderful experience for me, partly because I've gotten a chance to connect with Kate other than through Twitter and faculty meetings and emails, and spend some time sharing scotch and bourbon and the fire, which, by the way, Kate, has gone out behind you.
I have like a whole pile of wood down there, but
you've got a partner who could have been tending. John could have been tending to the fire while we were talking, but he stayed off camera. I want to thank Mike Matone, the president of our Alumni Association, and indeed, actually, I'm going to Mike, I'm going to unmute you so that you can join in and say hello to the assembled masses from our alumni. How you doing, Michael?
Wow, I'm glad I didn't walk away from my phone.
Well, we've got an app that can tell us whether you're paying attention or not.
Too soon, Mike. Too soon.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Mike. It's been this session has been a terrific respite from dealing with a lot of the issues that I think everybody has to deal with these days. So thanks for your time.
Well, and thank you, Michael. And I'm sure everything's just fine in the real estate business.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Mike's been a great partner to me and Brian in sort of moving the Alumni Association into the virtual world and into helping us launch the St. John's Law Student Emergency Fund. And I want to take a moment to thank everybody who has participated in that effort. It really was both sort of heart-wrenching and heartwarming to see the ways in which having to transition so quickly from in-person classes to online classes left a number of our students with critical needs as their housing got disrupted, as their technology needs changed, and our alumni were so quickly willing to step up and to help us fill that need. And as you probably know from the updates that we've sent out, we've been able to help a number of our students with relocation expenses, with housing challenges, with food insecurity, with technology issues, and really solve for our students the critical needs that would have prevented them from, in a meaningful way, continuing with their educational program. And just as our faculty and our staff transitioned so seamlessly is the wrong word, resolutely, I guess is the right word, to online teaching and remote work, we were able to bring along all of our students and keep all of them on track through their educational program. And that's our primary responsibility at this point. And it's been wonderful to have the alumni stepping up to help us. I'll put in one plug for our public interest auction, which would have happened in March. It's our biggest fundraiser to help fund summer public interest opportunities for our students. And of course, we weren't able to hold the auction. We are putting together an online auction for next week. It'll be Wednesday and Thursday, the 22nd and 23rd, I think are the dates. Keep your eye out from that. You'll be getting notices from Brian Woods about it, and encouragement to sign on and bid on some of the wonderful items that our students have compiled. There's a number of Apple products.
I will say, Jeremy Chef and I are offering a barbecue. Should anyone ever come out eventually from the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm offering a eminent domain tour of the Barclays Center, Atlantic Yards area, which pretty much is just like 3 blocks from like my house where I normally live. So it might be convenient for me, but as a property professor, it is also near and dear to my heart. And you should, the students last year loved it. It was really great. So.
Yes, and of course the in-person experiences are going to have to wait till Governor Cuomo tells us it's okay. And I'm going to have to wait to invite the students to my house and the various other things that we've hosted. But there's still a number of items that we can auction. Some generous alumni have donated a number of Apple products. We've got a number of other cool items, some desirable bottles of liquor. Kate's bottle of scotch can make its way to the online auction. And all of this will help us fund critical experiential opportunities for our students over the summer, particularly in ways that help support the public interest. It's another wonderful example of our alumni coming together to support the law school and to support our students. I want to thank the 6 people from our alumni who joined us tonight. I want to thank Kate for being the first guest on Law Matters, the new St. John's Law virtual alumni webcast. And Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you for the last words of wisdom from our law and tech expert.
Yeah. Okay. So I also want to say thank you. I'm honored to be the first guest for this. I am always, we're going into my, what year is it, Mike?
It's 2 years.
What year is it?
It's 2 years. You're starting your third.
I'm going into my 3rd year at St. John's, but one of the things, and one of the reasons I came to St. John's, and one of the reasons that I've always been glad to be here is the community that is here. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. I think that people on the faculty, the administration, from Joanna at the front desk to Mike at the dean's office, to Jeremy, to Eva, like to Anita, to John, like and everyone in between are just like wonderful faculty. It's a great community and the students are lovely. And just, I feel really heartened by the fact that so many of the alums showed up right now. I just gave my students a talk in both my classes in which I told them that they were going to have 24-hour finals and that I didn't want them to be pressured and have a lot of hardship over the finals. They're pretty much panicking over everything else in their life right now. And I said, this is not something you should be panicking about. Let's have some perspective. You know, I said, this is a moment of self-motivation. You're going to have to learn this stuff at some point, whether it's now or for the bar exam. And you've put aside the time and effort and money right now to learn it. And so let's learn it now. And this is about you learning this and not out of the fear of a final exam. I think that, like, you know, right after that, I got like 17 questions in my email inbox from my property class asking me like the finer points of forgery versus fraud. And I think I take that, like, either I taught it terribly, I don't think I did, but like I take it as they generally want to learn. And I just really love that it gave me actually I have a lot of emails to write, but it gave me a lot of like hope kind of going forward. These are just some great kids and we're going to have some great lawyers in our hands in the next couple of years. So thank you so much.
And I said I'm going to give you the last word. I'm just going to add this to our alumni who are watching this and sort of doing the math and realizing Kate graduated law school in 2012. I'm used to having faculty colleagues who are not just younger than me, but in a different generation. I think some of my former students are now surprised to see law professors who are younger than them. It's a wonderful part of being part of the St. John's Law community is the renewal that we get from our junior faculty. And when I look around at Kate and several of the other colleagues that we've hired over the last several years, who are going to be the backbone of the future of St. John's Law School, it makes me feel very good about the future of the law school. And Kate, it was a great experience for me to be able to introduce you in this way to our alumni. And thanks so much for being a part of it.
Yeah. Have a great night. I will say, I'm gonna put my pipe in.
Cheers, Kate.
Great night. I'm gonna go get some more scotch and some dinner. I'm starving because I've been on Zoom for like 17 hours. Talk to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye. Good night, all, and good night, Kate. So long.